I want to talk about briefly is the impact of Islamophobia, but particularly talk about what can we do about it, rather than just sort of talking about it. But I want to say that the fact that it is so strong, we have hit the highest point in terms of Islamophobia since 9/11. And at the same time, and this is what makes it even more dangerous, we've hit the highest point in terms of negativity of the press, of mass media, when it comes to dealing with Islam. And I'll give you some facts about that, because otherwise all you're hearing is this generalization. But it's also an issue overseas. I've just spent quite a few days, let's say from last Tuesday, and as I mentioned in my earlier talk, I think I did 12 presentations in Brussels, and 1 or 2 in London. The 12 in Brussels were with the EU itself, a number of sessions with members of Parliament, with the American mission there, with think tanks, and a lot of it dealt with either the Islamophobia and the impact on radicalization, or even when you don't mention Islamophobia and you deal with, for example, what's going on in the Muslim world, how should we respond to it, what are governments doing, what's the relationship between the U.S. and some of its allies. A good deal underlying that has to do with not Islamophobia in the way that you see it with some of the people here, but it has to do with your attitudes towards Islam and Muslims. That is, if you're talking to policymakers and they see the problems not in terms of the root causes in the region, which can have to do with authoritarian regimes, oppression, etc., and the fact that they support that, but rather they see it simply in terms of Islam or ideology. For example, if you look at CDE policy, combating violent extremism, I think lots of good analysts would say all those policies have been a failure so far. Part of that problem is that everyone starts and stays in the realm of Islam, ideology, theology. It's not that Islam is not involved in terms of a militant interpretation, but radicalization and the kinds of radicalization that we've seen and the recruitment are about the way in which not only Islam gets hijacked, but also the policies that outside governments use in supporting the very regimes that cause problems in their country. So, if you have a problem in a country, often you have a tension between masses of people with a regime that is oppressive, that is imprisoning people, etc., etc. But if you simply look and refuse to look at it, then there's an issue. I'll give you a concrete example. And I am limited tonight, and I haven't even got to the heart of my talk, so get breakfast for tomorrow, and we'll break up in about 8 hours. I was in a meeting, and I can't get very specific about this, in Washington, and it's not like it involved a number of government agencies, let's put it that way. And in that meeting, we were dealing with the issue of religion and violence. Now, at that meeting, at the end of it, was a very senior American government official who was talking about his experience. He'd spent his whole career in one of those agencies that's important. Let's say Defense, NSA, Pentagon, without getting specific. And so he talked about to others who were coming from all the agencies, let's say a kind of younger generation, mid-level generation. He said, this is the world that you're inheriting as opposed to the one that I came into and what we thought we would accomplish. We went into Iraq, it failed. We went in a second time, it failed. We went into Afghanistan, it failed. We went in a second time, it failed. We did win hearts and minds, it failed. ISIL, this was a year ago, he said this, with regard to ISIL, we're not handling it. Full stop. He never talked about the nature of governments in the region and what they're doing. He never talked about the way in which Western governments responded to the Arab Spring, the way in which when you had a coup, the President of the United States did not refer to it as a coup. The fact that many European powers were very quick, rather than saying you have your first democratically elected president, the way you replace him is with elections, not with a military-led coup. And that was very, very interesting because there actually is a videotape of a representative of the Secretary of State, an ambassador, in which she is before a congressional committee, and the head of the congressional committee said, can you, explain to me our policy, how we, you know, in effect, did not denounce the coup and are basically normalizing relations with Egypt. She said, well, we were really respecting a lot of the people, you know, in the street. In effect, the percentages had really dropped for Mr. Morsi. To which he said, I can think of a lot of presidents in the past whose numbers dropped precipitously. Would we have then said that the solution is that we would turn to the military to correct that? Or do you kind of continue that debate? So there are ways in which, even in our discussions on how to handle situations, for example, yeah, it doesn't really matter because I'm not saying exactly who. Somebody said, take Pakistan, for example. Governments have relations that enable Pakistan to export products and not have to pay high taxes. So maybe in exchange for that, we put pressure with regard to problems that we may see with regard to women's issues in Pakistan. And the way in which at times, and there are, you know, issues there. But nobody talked about the fact that if you say to a government, if you want to take that kind of position, and this is not true of Pakistan, but I'm talking about some other countries in the region, then you have to say, well, what about the nature of your government? For example, if you deal with certain Gulf states, you can't just say, gee, women ought to be able to drive a car. You have to deal with the broader issues in there that have to do with women, men, rights, ways to operate. Okay, let's take a look at, very briefly, the situation of where we are today with regard to Islamophobia. In a major study that was done looking at the realities today, and remember that Islamophobia is triggered by some real realities. We do have terrorists who attack in the name of Islam. We have had terrorists not only in the Muslim world, but terrorists in San Bernardino, in Paris, and certainly in Brussels. If you go to Brussels now and see the after effect in terms of not only the people that were killed, but that sense of tension within a society, one can understand. But we also have to consider media, particularly social media. How do media and social media portray Islam and Muslims? I'll get to it in a second, but the fact is right now, 9 out of 10 stories in the US, UK, Germany, and other places, 9 out of 10 are negative. Okay? Even mainstream stories, more than 50%, are negative. And when individuals are featured, they're warlords and jihadists. Think about if you did the reverse, with regard to, Western culture, and you just compartmentalize. I mean, for example, if you were portraying Western culture and you said, yes, France, liberty, equality, right? Then you had the reign of terror. More than 14,000 people were beheaded. When we talk about beheading these days and how it gets used in politics, nobody ever brings up their past if they happen to be Western countries. And then presidential elections, which I won't go into, but it's very obvious for presidential elections. Not just now, it's been going on since Obama first ran, presidential and congressional elections. You look at Sadiq Khan's election in London. You've got a man who has excellent credentials. The person he ran against was from a wealthy family, nice guy. Biggest issue was environment, and suddenly he wasn't doing it, but the people behind his campaign suddenly are putting out pictures of 7/7, the blowing up of buses, etc., when Sadiq Khan's father was, in fact, a bus driver. Suddenly, in other words, brushstroking the idea and raising questions about, well, then who is this really, man? Oh, here are pictures of people he went to dinner with, trying to kind of guilt by association, or even guilt of the people that he was associating with. So, I mean, that's where we really are. So it shouldn't be surprising that Trump, Carson, Cruz, and others. I'm doing a book, God willing, it'll be finished. It's the only book that I've been late in doing, because in between we had the uprisings in Egypt, but it's called Sharia, What Everyone Needs to Know. It'll be dedicated to Michelle Botman, to Rick Santorum, and some of the other idiots who've served in Congress and talk about Sharia and have no idea what it is. Have any of you seen the video of Rick Santorum when a group of Muslim students with a camera came around them after he spoke and started to ask him questions about Islam? He couldn't answer them. To his credit, he didn't storm out, but it made it worse. He just held his cup of coffee, and then he made some statements, and the students said, that's not the case. That's not accurate. But that's the discourse here. Note what I'm saying. It's not just media. It's our policymakers. And it's not just as in Europe, right-wing policymakers. It's our mainstream party policymakers who bring it up, and it then affects the refugee issue. And so the victims, the millions of victims, are treated as if they are terrorists, or that a significant number would be potential terrorists. Well, if you think you have a problem with profiling now, think about the blowback that can come from that. When you have people in Congress saying, in effect, we should keep them all out, and these are people who are running away from it because there may be quite a few people who are dangerous. Let me just read you something very briefly. And I'd like to see if anybody here, including some graduate students, can identify this. What I want to know is when you think this person made this statement about Islamophobia. For the general public in America and Europe today, Islam is news of a particularly unpleasant sort. The media, the government, geopolitical strategists, and although they are marginal to the culture, I love this one, at large, the academic experts on Islam are all in concert. Islam is a threat to Western civilization. Islam in the West, a clash of civilizations. Those sectors have the power and the will to propagate that image of Islam, and this image, therefore, becomes more prevalent, more present than all others. Sounds like it's recent. 1981, Edward Said. 1981, Edward Said. A decade before, you had the phrase clash of civilizations being used by Huntington and others. So we're talking about something with roots, but roots that most people didn't see. In my book, Islamic Threat, in the second edition, which came out in the late 1990s, I wrote about Islamophobia in Europe and America. We were not seeing that being talked about or written about. When was the first publication, major publication, in America? When did the first publication use the word Islamophobia on the front cover? It was the so-called Mosque at Ground Zero, Time magazine. A decade and a half after that phrase was used in Europe. So it was under the radar. I did programs with CNN during the break. People were saying, what's going on? Where is this coming from? When we already had deep roots. And when, in fact, Muslims were experiencing this after 9/11. And yet it was not being seen and contextualized. Whereas if it had been about African Americans or about Jews, we would have said it's racism, it's anti-Semitism. So that's kind of where we're, where we've been coming from. Now let me just talk very briefly about the contemporary media, and then I'll talk about what we need to do. Let me give you two hard facts, okay? There's a group called Media Tenor, T-E-N-O-R. And some of you, I've noticed, are all using your iPhone, which is abominable, but don't use it when I speak. Remember, those iPhones can make you sterilized for life. That'll kill that one. Okay, I was looking at my iPhone at my table. Go on your iPhone when you get a chance after this, if you're interested, and go to MEDIA, Media Tenor, T-E-N-O-R, and you'll see the stats on this in stories. They did a study of 975,000 pieces. This is an outfit that looks at the media in Europe and America every day. 100 or 200 people log in, all the articles. They looked at 975,000 pieces between 2001 and 2011 and said, in there, where is Islam in terms of portrayal? Okay? And they looked, and what did they see in 2001? 2% on extremism, 0.1% on ordinary Muslims, life in the Muslim world, Islam itself. 2% extremism, understandable, 0.1%, okay, mainstream. Jump to 2011, 2% goes up to 28%, okay? The other stays at 0.1%. Think about, okay, after 10 years, that incredible disjuncture now when you've got 28%. We have what I call intellectual, psychological, card-carrying Islamophobes. People who see Islam as evil, are bitter about it, and it comes from a kind of animus, the way some people are anti-Semitic because there's an animus. But there are a lot of Americans and a lot of Europeans who aren't those kinds of people. But they have the same attitudes often because all they know about Islam and Muslims is when they put their TV on and watch Fox or whatever and watch the portrayal, or particularly with social media today. When you have all kinds of stuff in social media, it's been already 2 limited studies have shown that more than $200 million has gone into supporting these Islamophobic websites and Islamophobic writers. More than $200 million, okay? And where's the money on the other side? Supporting, showing alternative narratives about who Muslims are, what Islam is about. Where are the alternative websites that step in? Because it's not just websites with the name Jihad Watch. Those are easy for one to say to somebody, well, if you really look at that, you know. But it's American Thinker, sounds good. Family Security, sounds good. Pajama Media, but these are right-wing think tanks. They deal a lot of political issues, not just Islam, but they're often very anti-immigrant and very anti-Muslim. Now, the latest study, as I said to you, is a study that shows that in the last year, that you now have moved to over 80% of the media coverage being negative, but in the US, UK, and Germany, it's 90%. But the fact that 80% is overwhelmingly negative shows you how bad media has gotten. So you've got the attacks go up, and the attitudes towards Islamophobia are strong. A major study done last year said that of all groups looking at discrimination and bias in America, clearly Muslims are the most misrepresented. And yet, the FBI's latest report says that the #1 danger with regard to terrorism is not Islamo-Muslims in its latest report. It's white, anti-American groups that have mushroomed in the last few years from maybe 200 to over 1,200. And that are training people to engage in violence, and many of them are behind a good deal of the violence that goes on in the country. Think about the terrible numbers of people that have been killed by militant Muslims, but think about the terrible numbers of people in America at the same time that have been killed in our high schools, etc., etc. A lot of the kind of mass killings that have, that have occurred. And yet we don't put all of that together and say, well, wait a minute, if we're really talking about, we've got like a double cancer here, but one is metastasizing a hell of a lot faster than the other. Okay, so what is it that we need to be thinking about doing? Let me see, I have this other one, but it's, I can't, well, sometime, if you go to, oh, here it is, just very quickly. Somebody studied the New York Times for the last 25 years, 2,667,000 pieces. And at the end, they discovered that as compared to Republican, Democrat in terms of media coverage, cancer, Yankees, Christianity, and alcohol, Islam had the highest incidence of negative terms over the 25 years. Think about that. Cancer, alcohol, etc. Okay? All right. So, what is it we need to be thinking about as we move forward? Avoid playing the fear card in political rhetoric. That exaggerates the magnitude of what is admittedly a dangerous terrorist act. And so, when you have presidential candidates that are playing that fear card, or when you have government officials who too quickly don't contextualize when they make a statement about Islam and Muslims, you have a problem. When you have a new report, I think it's the Air Force came out with a kind of study on approaching terrorism, and one of the factors that they identify as a possible sign of it is hijab. And that just came out a couple of months ago. You would think that all the agencies would be on board. But that kind of thing, when it gets out to the American public, what are they going to think? Combine that with media coverage. Indiscriminate and counterproductive anti-terrorism policies of profiling, monitoring mosques without having cause, without showing cause, the way you have to do anything. You don't monitor or wiretap somebody without going to a judge or somebody appropriate. You don't suddenly conclude, well, because then you're saying, why not monitor all Muslims, not just individual Muslims? Think about what happens when that happens. What happened to the Japanese, for example? Not in terms of exactly that, but when you in fact say that there's somehow a collective, potential collective guilt of a whole community. When you don't distinguish between a small group, of people who are hijacking their religion, and you keep constantly, how often do you see people all the time in the media now, as well as policymakers, saying, is it a problem with Islam? There's something about that religion. Islam needs reform. Well, you may need reform in a religion. All religions go through a period of reform. But the idea that somehow the heart of the need for reform is because it's connected to terrorism means that you're saying that mainstream Islam, rather than certain interpretations of Islam, are a problem. And by the way, parenthetically, that means that if you really want to step up, it's up to Muslims to identify those forms and be able to say it. Sometimes people don't want to get into the dirty, laundry, etc. But the fact is, somebody's got to be able to say that there's certain brands of Islam that are being exported around the world and have been in the U.S. and Europe for a good deal of time. And some of them are extremists, some of them are not, but they're so darn conservative that that worldview, which says, I'm right, everybody's wrong, I'm right, everybody's kuffar, including other Muslims, I'm right, and there's no real pluralism. You take somebody else and they wind up saying, but if that's the case and that's God's will, then it means we don't try to go through an electoral system. It means I have an obligation to attempt to impose that on everybody. And if not, then you move to the ISIL part, where you don't just kill Christians and Yazidis, you kill Shia, and you kill Sunnis who disagree with you. Okay, all of the above that are often attractive to politicians seeking to increase their base of support and favorable voter percentages, especially at election time, are a problem. I know a conservative Republican, there are also conservative Italians, I predicted it, I mean a conservative Muslim Republican. I used to say to Muslim communities 15 years ago, you're getting very successful, you'll do what a lot of other ethnic and religious groups do, you'll start going Republican, and then it's a slippery slope. But anyway, having said that, the reality of it is this fellow said to me that every time Representative King and people like him hold hearings, their numbers go up and their funds go up. Think about it with Carson. Think about it with Trump. But particularly Carson. You remember that story that about a week before he started making his comments about Muslims, some of his advisors had kind of said, tone down what you're saying, he went ahead and did it, and the next day his numbers went up and the money that was coming in went up. So that's that temptation. At a time when Islamophobia and media, both mass media and social media, are doing their negative coverage, it's not surprising that we're at an all-time high. So we have to figure out how to respond to that. Number one, what we have to do is get government more and more, and Muslims have to engage with government, and that is happening, working closely with the mainstream majority of Muslims. You're the community. You're the community that should be an example to them, and they should be saying, in effect, what's your faith about? What's your community? What are the problems you have? And you also have to be honest where there are problems. Because if you act as if there aren't any, then it takes away from the fact that the vast majority of your community is not a problem. The vast majority of the Islam that you follow is not a problem. You see what I mean? Because if you're in that kind of denial, then you're not distinguishing between, if you will, us and them, significantly enough. Need to promote the recruitment and hiring of qualified Muslim professionals in local and national government, and not just secular or nominal Muslims. This will be controversial with certain people, but they're not here tonight probably. But that's part of the problem too. A number of times when people do they're the safe people. Why are they safe? Because, I don't have to tell you why they're safe. Anyway, okay. The real pressure, though, has to be on our political leadership that has to think long-term as well as short-term. And the pressure within the community has to be that the community has to realize, as was said earlier today, which I love, should have been said a long time ago, the reality of it is your community is getting more and more involved. By your community, I mean the broader Muslim community. I'm not just talking about everybody here tonight, okay? But it's very important that more and more Muslims get into the system, the corporate system, law, government, media. It's going to be difficult, but it's important. Layla Al-Arian won a Peabody. Graduate of Georgetown, went to Columbia, still a young woman. Her husband is my successor as director of our center. Remarkable. Syed Muhammad Saeed's son has won a number of major awards for his media. We need more and more who do that, who do media and who do media that present alternative narratives. You see, if you can't expect, if we know that there's a problem with media, and the problem with media is, and you can't even blame them in a way, our society, our capitalist society, functions on the bottom line. the bottom line. You see Mr. Buffett commenting on he wants to save newspapers, but if you look at his analysis, he's also got to consider the bottom line. If it bleeds, it leads in media. That's what sells. We ran at Georgetown at my center. We had the editor-in-chief of Newsweek, who at that time was a PhD, Pulitzer Prize winner, intellectual who writes on Jefferson, and yet he said, when Muslims in the audience said, why don't you do more with mainstream Muslims? And he said, you know, our society's into conflict and conflict resolution. That's what sells. You know, look at the popular shows, not just the reality shows, the Sean Hannitys, the O'Reilly. It's not only what they say, it's the confrontational style. You know, and when you watch the news, right? The news is all about, 80% of the news is about death and destruction. My mother was from New York. She comes when I moved to Boston. She puts the news on in the morning and says, you have to leave. This is 20 years ago. The news starts with all the killings there. She's living in Brooklyn. She's living in, and most people from outside, when they go to New York, they're scared to even walk on the streets half the time. She moves to Washington after that, but she doesn't. I do. Puts the TV on again and says, you got to leave. If she were here now, in the last few years, believe me, she'd have me moving out. I mean, the reality of it is that it's important that young Muslims move in. You have a lock on doctors. You have a lock on. I remember recently, I mean, I've had so many incidents, but I have a very bad, I'm in perfect health, except that I have a very bad gastro situation, which comes from dealing with what I deal with. So I pump acid all the time. I can't read newspapers. I can't look at all this stuff. I just get aggravated. I pump acid. I have, you know, all kinds of problems. So I said to my wife one night, I was really sick a number of years ago. I was going to Dearborn. But I said, don't worry. I'll have more doctors in that audience than I have to worry about. And sure enough, as a joke, I just kidded. And I said, that particular audience, it worked beautifully. I said, I'd like all the physicians to raise their hand. And then I said, I'd like all the physicians, husband and wife, to raise their hand. Keep your hands up, and how about children of those physicians? It was phenomenal. So the last time I was back, I had a family pick me up, and the fellas, he was a physician, wife was a physician, kid was a physician, daughter got out, who was the other kid. She got out to get another car, and he said, she's wonderful. She's a lawyer, but she's a good lawyer. You know? I mean, and he meant it was a good lawyer, but it was like they kind of were hoping that, you know, there'd be kind of grand slam on that thing. All right, so that's really important. And the final thing is, and this is, I mean, this is going to be a generic thing, but I'm really sorry to have to say it, and I've said it for God knows how many years. You're making it as a community. You now have Muslim Americans who are in a position, in a financial position, to make things happen, to support projects to make things happen, to support Muslim kids getting educated, and there are such projects, but not enough, being able to go to the best universities, to support projects. I have some of my students come out and they have incredible projects that deal with the community. And in some cases, their parents are multimillionaires, and the kids writing to me and saying, gee, we can't raise money. Do you have any suggestions on how we can raise money? I want to say go home again and raise it with, you know, mom and pop at night. The same thing is true with a lot of these issues. If we're talking about just 2 studies, and now 3, that show that something like $225 million has been given, and there's probably a lot more. These are just, and this is based, by the way, on IRS returns, okay? Where's the community addressing those kinds of issues? So that you should be involved in. You should also be looking to Islamophobia projects. I'm going to mention mine, but you don't have to look to mine because mine is the best around, and we did that pretty quickly. But you've got to deal with, there are other Islamophobia projects that are out there, and they have a name, but they don't have the resources. They're 2 and 3 people. You can't make it. I'll give you and I'll end with this example. We started something called The Bridge. But note the way we called it. The Bridge, protecting pluralism. That's what you emphasize. Ending Islamophobia. You see, it's the pluralism. For example, if you want to make a case for the fact that a woman has a right to wear hijab, she also has a right to not wear it, but she has a right. Don't make it into, narrowly speaking, an Islam issue. It is an issue with regard to American and European principles and values. Freedom, freedom of religion, freedom of speech. They wish the freedom of every woman to control how she dresses, her body, etc., and not have somebody. You don't have the situation in Switzerland where you wind up with a $5,000 fine being projected for young Muslim boys or girls who, when they go into a Swiss school, there is a custom in Swiss schools. When you go in, you greet your teacher, and it's a way of establishing a relationship, and you shake hands. For some of these kids, for religious reasons, they don't want to shake hands. But in order to stay within the Swiss system, if it's a young man and he doesn't want to shake hands with a female teacher, he also will not shake hands with a male so that it doesn't look like sexual discrimination. Very smart. But that's not being accepted so far, which means that therefore it will be forbidden. It also then, in effect, becomes a whole blown out of proportion negative thing. For those that are already negative, it's like, oh, look at how dramatic or different from our society or how radical, things are. And to have a $5,000 fine. These things need to be addressed by organizations. So we started this bridge and emphasized protecting pluralism, etc. But what we do is not just what all the other Islamophobia projects do. We do what some of the other ones do, and that is the realization you just don't expose and write articles, which you have to do to say, who are these people, where do they get their money from, here's the kind of things that they write. We do a lot of stuff like on Trump and Carson and refute the stuff that they say, or what some of the Islamophobes say, okay? But you've got to have alternative narratives out there. You've got to have an alternative to what's out. The narrative that's in the media, we know what it is. It's negative. The narrative that social media is negative. The narrative that comes from a lot of our politicians is negative. What do you expect from the average American? Many of whom say, in Gallup polling that I've been associated with, that they don't know any Muslims. And what they know about Islam, they get from the media. So you've got to have but the alternative narrative is not just statements. You know what I mean? It's not enough writing about Muslims or writing about the fact that they're professionals. Who cares? Practically, what's important is you write about physicians that have free clinics and that are open to everybody. Muslims who are engaged, as I said earlier today, who are engaged in soup kitchens, shelters, who are engaged with other Muslim families in addressing educational problems in the community, drug problems in the community, who actually, share meals together. Those are the kinds of narratives, and that means the kind of video that I saw today, where you have, a Muslim who, because of his faith, reaches out to the Salvation Army, as well as runs projects, clinics in Pakistan, projects here. Those stories, those videos, those narratives need to be out on the internet. They need to be put up on websites. They need to be, on YouTube. When you see all the stories that are coming out slowly now about Muslims both here and overseas, the election of a mayor, etc., in London, or you have, even better than that, Muslims are now being featured. Some of you saw that. A woman in England won like the top baking award. No non-Brit has ever won it. Well, I don't know if you've ever had British food, but the fact is, go to Britain and try to find a British restaurant. There aren't any, But in any case, but I know that there are Brits who can bake. This woman won, and she wears hijab, but they didn't say, here's a Muslim. On the other hand, I was with a MEP, that is a member of parliament from Britain, Pakistani Muslim in background, who was the mayor of Manchester, then was elected, and was elected when Nick Griffith, the head of the right-wing group, they came from the same area and ran. Well, Griffith referred to all of his 7 opponents by saying, member of the Conservative Party, Labour Party. When he referred to this guy, he said, Muslim Labour. Well, he won, Griffith lost. But the important thing was that situation, that situation that occurred. These are the challenges that we have. And what I'm saying here is that you as community members with your kids, you want to really encourage and open them to go into these other fields to get the best education, but you also need to get behind the kinds of projects you already have and multiply them and get that coverage in the media. Find ways to do that. If you have stories like that, send them to us. We have a site, bridge.georgetown.edu, in which we not only run stories, we do all kinds of and are developing a video, all kinds of, we're doing interviews now, we're sending people out to see established physicians who run clinics and have them tell their story. These are the kinds of things you have to get an alternative. And the thing that will happen is, and I'll end with this, it used to be, in the old days, that it was mass media that got the story first, and then it got picked up on social media. It's the reverse now. When a few years ago, 2 years ago, I spoke at a Muslim fundraiser with Siraj Wahaj and 3 other people. It was outside of Dallas. It was a Muslim fundraiser, only Muslims going to it. And Pamela Geller heard that Siraj Wahaj and I were among the 2. The next thing you knew, she got on social media. The next thing you knew, we had helicopters, FBI, you name it there, demonstrations, etc. The reality of it is, that's when O'Reilly picked it up. Just the reverse of what had happened only a short time ago. It would have been the O'Reilly show does something and social media goes bananas. Instead, Geller did this, brought in people from around the country. O'Reilly picked it up and then sent a reporter. And parenthetically, Geller then, because she didn't get the coverage she wanted, then had a second one that did the cartoons of the Prophet in the same location, and that's where you had outside Muslims come in and attempt to kill the people. So it's being aware of that situation and learning to address it. And remember, that America is no different than Lebanon, where my wife and I lived there in 1971-72. We had a young guy who helped us get our license for the cars, helped us get our stuff, you know, and then he said, you're a young couple and you seem like a nice young couple, and I'm going to tell you something that'll help you live in my country. So I'm waiting for those pearls of wisdom, you know, something cultural, something, you know, reach out and touch someone. I'm exaggerating a bit. And he said, that's the way you get things done, he said, in our country. Everything. Otherwise, it takes you 2 weeks, 4 weeks. Well, in America, that's the way you get it done. And if you don't do it, it'll take years. Thank you.